Beat my son!
The metallic click echoed in the silence of Tae-Hyun's soul, a sound more final than any court sentence. Time didn't just slow down, it fractured. He saw Mason's eyes, the confusion shifting into a sharp, jagged terror as he realized his father wasn't just angry, he was horrified. Out! Mason, get out! Tae-Hyun's hands clawed at the door handle, his expensive suit jacket bunching at the shoulders as he exerted a strength born of pure, unadulterated desperation. The door groaned, the security locks fighting against him for one heartbeat too long. The air itself seemed to draw a deep, sharp breath before the world vanished into a roar. The blast didn't start with fire. It started with a wall of invisible, concussive force that shattered the tinted windows into a million diamonds of light. In that microsecond, Tae-Hyun didn't retreat. He didn't dive for the concrete floor. He lunged into the opening door, throwing his entire frame over the boy. He became a canopy of wool and flesh, a human shield against the jagged geometry of the coming storm. Then came the heat. A blossoming, white-hot flower of orange and black erupted from beneath the chassis. The shockwave slammed into Tae-Hyun's back like a freight train, lifting both father and son and hurling them across the oil-stained concrete. Tae-Hyun felt the searing heat lick at his neck, the smell of burning fabric and ozone filling his lungs. His ears rang with a high, steady whistle that drowned out the world. Pain was a distant, abstract concept. All that mattered was the weight beneath him. He squeezed Mason tighter, his arms locked around the boy's ribs, shielding the child's head against his own chest as they tumbled. They came to a rest 20 feet away, shrouded in a thick, choking veil of black smoke and drifting ash. The car was a skeleton of fire behind them, the crackle of burning rubber the only sound in the aftermath. Tae-Hyun gasped, his lungs burning, his vision blurred by a trickle of blood from his forehead. Every muscle screamed, and his back felt as though it had been flayed by a lash of fire. He groaned, his grip trembling as he forced his heavy limbs to move. He pushed himself up just enough to look down. Mason lay beneath him, pale and trembling, his face covered in soot but his eyes open, searching his father's face with a shocked, silent intensity. "Mason," Tae-Hyun rasped, the word tasting like copper and smoke. He reached out a shaking hand, brushing a shard of glass from the boy's hair. "Mason, look at me. Are you whole?" For the first time in 15 years, the boss was gone. There was no syndicate, no rival, and no empire. There was only a man on his knees in the dirt, weeping silent, soot-stained tears of relief because his son was still breathing. The 0 hour had passed, and while the car was destroyed, the wall Tae-Hyun had built between them had finally burnt to ash. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee replaced the scent of smoke, but the ringing in Tae-Hyun's ears remained, a dull hum that isolated him from the world. They were in the basement of a nondescript warehouse, an underground clinic staffed by a doctor who didn't ask questions and didn't keep records. Tae-Hyun sat on the edge of a rusted examination table, his shirt discarded. The doctor was meticulously picking shards of glass from the angry, red lattice of burns across his back, but Tae-Hyun didn't flinch. His gaze was anchored to the curtained area across the room where Mason lay. When the curtain finally slid back, Mason looked small beneath the fluorescent lights. A white bandage was taped to his temple, and his arm was in a sling, but he was alive. Blake Carter stood by the door, a silent sentinel with a radio buzzing in his ear, while Debbie Hayes paced the perimeter, her eyes glued to her tablet, tracking the movements of Graves' men. "Give us the room," Tae-Hyun commanded. His voice was a low rasp, stripped of its usual iron. Blake and the doctor retreated into the shadows of the hallway. For a long moment, the only sound was the hum of the cooling fans. Tae-Hyun stood, his movements stiff and pained, and walked to his son's side. He reached out to touch Mason's shoulder, but the boy pulled away, his movement sharp and defensive. "Don't," Mason whispered. He looked up, his eyes bright with a mixture of residual shock and years of simmering resentment. He wasn't looking at a hero. He was looking at a stranger who happened to share his blood. You saved me back there. I get it. You're the big boss. But you didn't save us 4 years ago. Tae-Hyun felt a coldness in his chest that no explosion could match. I did what I had to do to keep you and your mother safe, Mason. My world is a furnace. I couldn't let you burn in it. So you just vanished? Mason's voice rose, cracking with the weight of his teenage years spent wondering. You sent checks. You sent guards we didn't see. But you never sent a letter. You never showed up to a game. Why did you leave us, Dad? Why was your throne more important than being at the dinner table? Tae-Hyun looked at his scarred hands, the hands that had built an empire and broken men, and for the first time, they felt useless. The boss would have had a calculated answer about strategic necessity and the geometry of power. But the father, the man who had just felt the heat of a bomb meant for him, had nothing but the truth. I was a coward, Tae-Hyun admitted, the words tasting like ash. I thought if I didn't love you out loud, Graves couldn't use you against me. I thought distance was a shield. I was wrong. I left because I was afraid I'd destroy you just by being near you. And today, I almost did anyway. Mason didn't look away, but the hardness in his jaw softened just a fraction. The silence between them was no longer a void. It was a bridge, fragile and beginning to form over the wreckage of the life they had both lost. The heavy steel door of the warehouse groaned on its hinges, admitting a gust of cold night air and the sharp click of heels against concrete. Rachel Kang didn't enter the room. She invaded it. Even in a simple trench coat with her hair windswept and frantic, she carried the regal, shattered elegance of a woman who had spent years holding a crumbling world together. She ignored Blake and Debbie entirely, her eyes locked on the silhouette of Tae-Hyun standing over their son. When she reached Mason, she pulled him into a desperate, crushing embrace, her hands trembling as she checked his face, his arms, and the bandage on his temple. Mason sagged into her, the bravado he had shown his father vanishing instantly in the presence of his mother. He's okay, Rachel, Tae-Hyun said, his voice cracking like dry parchment. The doctors say. The sound of the slap echoed through the hollow warehouse like a gunshot. Tae-Hyun's head snapped to the side, a fresh trail of blood seeping from the cut on his forehead where her ring had caught him. He didn't move to touch his face. He didn't even blink. He simply took it, knowing he deserved far worse than the sting of her palm. Don't you dare speak to me about what the doctors say, Rachel hissed, her voice a low, vibrating chord of fury and grief. Her eyes, red-rimmed and fierce, scanned the room, the blood-stained gauze, the illegal medical equipment, the armed men standing guard in the shadows. Look at where we are, Tae-Hyun. Look at what you've done to him. I saved him, Tae-Hyun whispered, though even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. You saved him from a fire you lit. Rachel stepped toward him, her fingers stabbing at his chest, right over the heart he had spent years pretending he didn't have. I let you walk away 4 years ago because you promised me that your shadow would never touch us. You said the divorce was a wall. You said the distance was a shield. And now my son has the scent of burning gasoline in his lungs because his father is a king of nothing. She turned back to Mason, her ferocity melting into a protective, maternal shroud. She began to gather their things, her movements jerky and determined. He's coming with me. We are leaving. I don't care about your rivals or your wars. I will take him into the woods, into the sea, anywhere your name isn't spoken. Graves won't stop, Rachel, Tae-Hyun said, his voice regaining a sliver of its command, though it was heavy with sorrow. He knows Mason was in that car. The wall is gone. There is no way left for you to go. Rachel froze, the reality of his words sinking in like a slow-acting poison. She looked at the grimy ceiling, then back at the man who had been her husband, her eyes finally breaking as the first tear fell. The broken queen realized that the sanctuary she had built was a lie. The Mafia's blood-red world hadn't just bled into theirs, it had drowned it. The heavy silence that followed Rachel's realization was broken only by the rhythmic tapping of Debbie Hayes's fingers against her tablet. The blue light of the screen cast ghostly shadows across her face, highlighting the grim set of her mouth. Tae-Hyun stood by the rusted window, his back, still raw and bandaged, aching with every breath, while Blake Carter remained a silhouette against the door, his hand never straying far from the weapon at his hip. "It's confirmed," Debbie said, her voice cutting through the damp air like a blade. She turned the tablet toward Tae-Hyun, displaying a series of encrypted wire transfers and grainy surveillance stills. "Leonard Graves didn't just stumble onto your schedule. This wasn't a lucky guess. He had a map." Tae-Hyun moved closer, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the data. The logistics of the parking garage ambush were too precise. Graves had known exactly which vehicle Mason had slipped into, and more importantly, he had known the exact window of time when Tae-Hyun's primary security detail would be rotated. "Graves is the hand holding the match," Blake added, his voice low and gravelly. "But someone inside this house opened the door for him. The bomb's trigger was synced to your personal transponder, Tae-Hyun. Only 3 people had access to that frequency." The air in the warehouse grew cold. Tae-Hyun looked at Blake, his most loyal soldier, and then at Debbie, the woman who knew his deepest secrets. The circle of trust, already small, felt as if it were shrinking into a noose. Mason sat on the exam table, watching the adults with wide, hollow eyes, realizing that the explosion wasn't just an ending, but the start of a much more intimate hunt. "The digital trail leads back to a burner phone activated within your own headquarters," Debbie continued, swiping to a map that showed a pulsing red near the syndicate's central hub. "Someone has been feeding Graves your movements for months. They didn't just want you dead, they wanted your legacy erased. That's why Mason was the target. They wanted to ensure there was nothing left of the Kang name to fight back." Tae-Hyun's jaw tightened until it felt like stone. He had spent his life looking for enemies in the shadows of Seoul's alleys, never realizing the most dangerous one might have been sitting at his right hand, laughing at his table. "We can't go to the main safe house," Tae-Hyun decided. His voice regained its lethal edge. He looked at Rachel, who was clutching Mason's hand as if she could shield him with her own skin. "If there's a rat in the ranks, every fortress I built is a tomb. We go off the grid. No guards, no cars, no legacy." "Where?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Tae-Hyun looked at the flickering fluorescent light above them. "Somewhere a mafia boss wouldn't be caught dead. Somewhere Graves would never think to look for a king." He turned to Debbie. "Find us a place where we can be invisible. The war is moving indoors." The safe house was a beige, unremarkable split level in a quiet suburb of Gyeonggi-do, a place where the air smelled of freshly mown grass instead of high-octane fuel and gunpowder. There were no marble floors here, no guards at the perimeter, and no silent servants. To a man who had spent his life in the hollowed-out grandeur of penthouses and armored SUVs, the silence of the neighborhood was more deafening than a gunshot. Inside the cramped kitchen, Tae-Hyun stood before a laminate countertop, his large frame looking absurdly out of place. He had discarded his tailored blazer for a plain gray hoodie to hide the bandages, and his holster, the heavy, cold weight that usually sat against his ribs, had been replaced by a cheap apron Rachel had found in a drawer. In his hand, the sleek, black steel of his weapon was gone, replaced by a stainless steel kitchen knife that felt light and clumsy in his grip. He was attempting to mince garlic, but his hands, so steady when aiming a pistol, trembled as he worked. Across the room, Mason sat at a small wooden dining table, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on the wall with a cold, jagged intensity. He hadn't spoken since they arrived. "I remember you liked this," Tae-Hyun said quietly, gesturing to the ingredients for dakgalbi spread across the counter. "Your mother told me once, years ago. People change in 4 years," Mason replied, his voice flat. "I don't even remember what I liked when you were actually around." The words were a calculated strike, more precise than any hitman's bullet. Tae-Hyun didn't look up. He focused on the rhythm of the knife, the sharp thwack 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 against the cutting board. He was a man who could command 1,000 soldiers with a nod, yet he felt entirely powerless in the presence of this teenager who shared his eyes. "The rules are simple here," Tae-Hyun said, trying to steer the conversation toward the tactical, the only language he still knew. We don't use the front door. We keep the curtains closed. We don't touch the Wi-Fi. We are ghosts, Mason. If we exist to the world, we die. We've been ghosts to you for years, Mason snapped, finally turning to look at his father. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed and fierce. The only difference is now we're stuck in the same haunted house as the guy who killed us. Tae-Hyun stopped chopping. He looked at the knife in his hand, then at the reflection of his scarred, weary face in the window. He realized that while Graves was hunting them from the outside, the real battle was happening right here, over a half-prepped dinner. He set the knife down and turned to face his son, the apron strings a mocking reminder of the life he was trying to reclaim. I know I can't fix 4 years with a meal, Tae-Hyun said softly. But I'm not the boss tonight, Mason. I'm just the man who's making sure you're fed. Mason didn't respond, but he didn't leave the table. He simply watched as his father turned back to the stove, a fallen king trying to learn how to be a father in the steam of a crowded kitchen. The stillness of the suburban morning was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the hollow thud of a cardboard box landing on the porch. Tae-Hyun was at the door before the delivery truck had even rounded the corner, his hand hovering near the kitchen knife tucked into his waistband. He didn't open it immediately. He stood in the entryway, the shadows of the hallway masking the tension in his jaw, waiting for the ticking that never came. When he finally brought the package inside, Rachel and Mason were huddled at the small dining table, the morning sunlight mocking them with its brightness. Tae-Hyun used a pocket knife to slit the tape, his movements clinical and precise. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet that looked like a funeral shroud, lay a single item, a golden onyx cufflink. Tae-Hyun's breath hitched. It was the match to the one he had lost in the parking garage, the one he thought had been vaporized in the blast. It was a piece of him, returned like a trophy. Beneath the jewelry lay a glossy photograph. Rachel leaned in, then let out a sharp, stifled sob, her hand flying to her mouth. The photo wasn't of them. It was a high-angle shot of the front gates of Mason's school, taken just 3 days ago. In the corner of the frame, a red circle had been drawn around a figure in the background, a man in a dark suit standing by a black car, watching the students file inside. He was there, Mason whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at the image of the place where he was supposed to be safe. He was right there. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that their invisibility was an illusion. The beige walls of the safe house, which had felt like a sanctuary only hours before, now felt like the thin fabric of a tent in a thunderstorm. Graves wasn't just hunting them. He was playing with them, showing Tae-Hyun that no matter how many aprons he wore or how many miles he put between them and the city, the boss could never truly outrun his shadow. Tae-Hyun felt the old, cold fire of the syndicate leader rising in his chest, a lethal heat that threatened to consume the father he was trying to become. He looked at the cufflink, a symbol of the life that was currently killing his family. He's not asking for a meeting, Tae-Hyun said, his voice dropping into a register that made the room feel smaller. He's telling me the price. We have to leave, Tae-Hyun, Rachel pleaded, grabbing his arm, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate light. We'll go further. We'll leave the country. No, Tae-Hyun replied, his gaze fixed on the photo of the school. He reached out and picked up the cufflink, crushing it in his fist until the metal bit into his palm. If we run, he just follows. Graves doesn't want the Empire anymore. He wants the one thing I have left. He looked at Mason, whose face was pale but determined. The game has changed. I'm done hiding. The blue glow of the safe house television cast long, flickering shadows across the living room, but the volume was muted. Tae-Hyun sat by the window, not watching the news, but staring into the rhythmic sweep of headlights on the wet street outside. Behind him, Mason was hunched over a laptop, the tension in his shoulders a permanent fixture since the delivery of the box. Come here, Mason, Tae-Hyun said softly, his voice barely a murmur. Mason hesitated, then slumped over to the window. Tae-Hyun didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on a silver SUV parked 3 houses down. Look at the side mirror of that car. Don't stare, just graze it with your vision. You see the glint. Mason squinted. Yeah, is that them? No, that's a neighbor's car. But look at the white sedan that just turned the corner. Tae-Hyun instructed, his hand settling on Mason's shoulder. This time, the boy didn't flinch. Notice the speed. He's hovering just below the limit, eyes moving between the house numbers and his rear view. He's passed this street twice in 20 minutes. That's a soft tail. They aren't here to hit us yet. They're mapping our breath. For the first time, Tae-Hyun wasn't speaking to his son in riddles or distant promises. He was opening the iron gates of his world, letting the boy see the cold mechanics of survival. He explained the 3-turn rule, how to take 3 consecutive right turns to see if the car behind stays glued to your bumper. He spoke of trigger points, the invisible lines in a landscape that, once crossed, meant the situation had shifted from observation to execution. I spent 4 years trying to make sure you never knew these things, Tae-Hyun whispered, his gaze finally meeting Mason's. I thought if I kept you in the dark, the light would stay on. But I left you blind instead. Mason looked out at the dark street, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. You're teaching me how to be like you. I'm teaching you how to stay alive, Tae-Hyun corrected. Because Graves thinks you're a weakness. I need him to realize you're a strategist. As the white sedan vanished into the night, Mason leaned his head slightly against his father's arm. The contact was brief, almost accidental, but it was the first piece of solid ground they had found in years. In the silence of the safe house, the boss wasn't hiding a secret anymore. He was sharing a burden. They sat together in the dark, 2 ghosts learning how to hunt the things that haunted them, finally speaking the same dangerous language. The silence of the safe house was broken only by the low hum of the refrigerator and the frantic, rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway. Tae-Hyun stood in the center of the kitchen, pulling on a clean black suit jacket that felt like a suit of armor he had outgrown. He didn't check his reflection. He didn't need to see the man he was becoming. He only needed to see the path ahead. I'm leaving, he said, his voice dropping into the cold, mechanical tone of the boss. Rachel stood by the sink, her hands bone white as she gripped the counter. You're going to him. You're giving him exactly what he wants. No, Tae-Hyun countered, his eyes shifting to Mason, who stood in the doorway. I'm giving him what he thinks he wants. If I stay here, the tails we spotted tonight will eventually become a firing squad. By the time the sun rises, Graves will have his men at every exit of this house. But if I surrender at the harbor docks, he'll pull every blade he has off this street to witness my fall. He walked over to Rachel, reaching out to touch her cheek. She didn't pull away this time, but her eyes were brimming with a terrified, silent plea. When the white sedan follows me out of this neighborhood, you take the back trails Blake mapped out. Don't look back. Don't wait for a signal. Just disappear. Tae-Hyun turned to Mason. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted burner phone, pressing it into the boy's hand. Remember what I taught you tonight. Watch the angles. Listen to the silence. If I'm not at the extraction point in 3 hours, you take care of your mother. Dad, don't, Mason whispered, the word dad hitting Tae-Hyun harder than any physical blow. The boy's eyes weren't filled with hate anymore, but with the crushing weight of a son who had just found his father only to lose him again. It's the only way to clear the board. Mason, Tae-Hyun said, his gaze hardening. He thinks I'm coming to beg for mercy. He doesn't realize I'm coming to set the fire. He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out the door, the heavy click of the lock behind him sounding like a gavel. He stepped into the night air, the cool breeze hitting his face as he walked toward the car parked at the curb. He saw the flicker of a cigarette in a darkened vehicle 2 houses down, the tail. Tae-Hyun sat in the driver's seat, gripped the wheel, and started the engine. He made no effort to be subtle. He let the headlights cut through the dark, signaling his departure with the arrogance of a king. As he pulled away from the curb, he checked his rearview mirror. The white sedan's lights flickered to life, pulling out to follow him. The bait was taken. As the predators followed the boss toward the city, the man behind the wheel felt a grim satisfaction. He was leading the wolves away from the only light he had left in the world, ready to face the 0 hour on his own terms. The industrial crane shadows at the Incheon docks stretched like skeletal fingers over the meeting point. Tae-Hyun stood under the harsh amber hum of the floodlights, his hands raised, his silhouette framed by the black expanse of the sea. Leonard Graves stepped out of the darkness, flanked by a dozen armed men, his smile a jagged scar of triumph. The great Kang Tae-Hyun, Graves mocked, his voice echoing against the shipping containers. Reduced to a beggar in a suit. Where is the ledger, Tae-Hyun? Give me the keys to the kingdom, and maybe I'll let your son live to see 20. Tae-Hyun's expression didn't flicker. He reached slowly into his inner breast pocket, pulling out a silver flash drive instead of a gun. You think I came here to negotiate, Leonard? Tae-Hyun's voice was a low, terrifying calm. I didn't come to give you the empire. I came to delete it. Graves' smile faltered as Tae-Hyun pressed a single button on the side of the drive. Miles away, in a secure, encrypted server room Debbie Hayes had spent the last 48 hours infiltrating, a logic bomb detonated. It wasn't made of gunpowder, but of truth. Every offshore account, every bribe to the city council, every shipping manifest of illegal cargo, and every recorded conversation that tied the Kang syndicate to the Graves organization began flooding into the servers of the National Intelligence Service and the global press simultaneously. By now, Tae-Hyun said, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. The authorities are freezing every asset we've ever touched. The banks are locking the vaults. The police are at the doors of the headquarters. There is no kingdom left to rule for either of us. Graves lunged forward, his face contorted in a mask of primal rage, but the sound of distant sirens began to wail, cutting through the salt air. The rat in the ranks had been bypassed. Tae-Hyun had bypassed his own hierarchy entirely, burning the very ground he stood on to ensure Graves had nowhere to plant his feet. You're going down with me. Graves screamed, leveling his weapon at Tae-Hyun's chest. I died the moment that car exploded in the garage, Tae-Hyun replied, stepping toward the barrel of the gun without a shred of fear. Everything I'm doing now is for the man I want my son to remember. The lights of a dozen tactical vehicles rounded the corner of the pier, their red and blue strobes painting the containers in the colors of a final judgment. Tae-Hyun watched the empire he had spent a decade building vanish into a sea of litigation and scandal. He had traded his crown for a clean slate, and as the zip ties tightened around his wrists, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in years. The boss was dead, and the fire he had set was finally burning the right things. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint, sweet scent of cherry blossoms and the distant hum of a city that had long since forgotten the name Kang Tae-Hyun. A year had passed since the headlines had been dominated by the spectacular collapse of the twin syndicates. A year since the Mafia King had vanished into the labyrinth of witness protection and legal settlements. Tae-Hyun sat on a weathered park bench, wearing a nondescript navy windbreaker and a baseball cap pulled low. In his hand was a lukewarm paper cup of coffee, the steam rising to meet the cool spring breeze. He looked like any other man enjoying a quiet Saturday, his face no longer set in a mask of lethal command, but softened by a weary, earned peace. 50 yards away, near a vibrant playground, Mason stood at a podium. It wasn't a grand stage, just a small community center ceremony for a youth robotics competition, but to Tae-Hyun, it was more significant than any board meeting he had ever chaired. Mason looked taller, his posture straight and confident, his face free of the hollow terror that had haunted him in the parking garage. Beside him stood Rachel, her eyes bright with a pride that wasn't shadowed by fear. Tae-Hyun didn't move to join them. He stayed in the periphery, a guardian in the shadows. He watched as Mason received a small trophy, his son's laughter carrying across the grass, a sound that was pure, untainted by the weight of a legacy he no longer had to carry. Tae-Hyun's hands, once stained with the ink of illicit ledgers and the blood of rivals, now rested quietly in his lap. He had lost his empire, his wealth, and his name, but as he watched Mason high-five a teammate, He knew he had won the only war that mattered. A single tear traced a path down Tae-Hyun's cheek, catching the morning light. It wasn't a tear of regret, but of profound, overwhelming relief. He had dismantled his world so that his son could build his own. He was no longer a boss, no longer a king, and no longer a threat. He was a ghost who had finally found his soul. Rachel turned her head then, her gaze sweeping across the park. For a heartbeat, her eyes met the man on the bench. There was no wave, no shout, no public acknowledgement that could break their cover. There was only a slow, graceful nod, a silent thank you from the queen to the man who had finally learned how to protect his family by letting them go. Tae-Hyun stood up, adjusted his cap, and turned to walk toward the exit. He didn't need to be in the photo to be part of the story. As he blended into the crowd of mourning joggers and young families, he disappeared into the most beautiful thing he had ever created, a normal life. The tears finally dried, replaced by a steady, quiet smile. He was in plain sight, and for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged.